The ship fell like a torn constellation, a seam of fire across the pre-dawn sky. On the command dais of the Azrith cruiser Quiet Tongue, Commander Threx held his breath while the console bathed his 4 pupils in a sickly red. The antimatter manifolds had failed. The gravitic sails were ragged spectra. He listened to the ship's spine complain, a 1,000-year-old craft learning the vocabulary of gravity for the first time. "Emergency descent," he ordered. "Nearest blue world. Primitive, harmless." Primitive was a word that carried comfort. It promised that what he did next would never matter. When the Quiet Tongue knifed through clouds and howled over mountains, Threx told himself that the forest below would understand none of it. Not the taste of copper in the air, not the mathematics of failure carving a furrow through spruce and stone. When at last the ship came to rest in a valley of glacial lakes, he counted the living and the dead, set the self-scrub protocols to 1/3 of their strength, and transmitted a beacon to the nearest Azrith patrol. "Salvage impossible," his engineer said softly. "We leave the husk." Threx lingered in the corridor that once smelled of ozone and citrus bark polish. He laid his palm to the living metal, felt it still trying to knit while star wind bled from it. He whispered the Azrith benediction for ships. "You carried us. May our memory carry you," and departed a world he named unimportant. On a ridge 200 miles away, a meteorologist in Montana watched the sky blink and did not see a meteor. A chain of quiet calls escalated to louder rooms. By noon, a convoy of unmarked trucks had already crossed the border into the Canadian wilderness with permits nobody would ever see. The first to step through the fractured hull was Dr. Meyer Ellison, Xenosystems engineer by training, daughter of a history teacher by temperament. She said nothing for a long time, the way some people behave in churches and libraries. The crash gallery was a museum of paradox, walls of self-healing crystal, slumped like candle wax, a navigation core that hummed like a hive, thinking in colors the human brain couldn't hold, a medical theater that smelled faintly of citrus bark, polish, and grief. On a dais the size of a city bus sat a cracked gravity heart, lattices of unknown elements that reminded Meyer of spiderwebs after a storm. "Can we move it?" asked General Grant Rivera, whose whole job was to weigh miracles against consequences. "We can understand it first," Maya said. "Then we decide what we deserve." They called the effort Project Foundry because nothing about it would be excavation. It would be heat, force, reforming, an American habit as old as iron rails and as new as reusable rockets. By nightfall, tents and clean rooms glowed against the tree line. A line of flags snapped in a cold wind, not just one country's, but a coalition of allies that had learned in messy centuries that world-changing things go badly when shared by too few hands. The first council met in the Quiet Tongue's wounded wardroom. A physicist from Georgia Tech noodled on a whiteboard and muttered about quantum foam. A machinist from Milwaukee looked at the Azrith armor and said, "I can weld that if you can tell me what it is." A linguist turned the eye's choral murmurs into phonemes and then into meanings: regret, repair, restraint. Someone read the Azrith maintenance hymns out loud and had to stop because her voice broke. "We need to talk about ownership," said Senator Leela NG, patched in over a secure link. "Is this salvage? Is this theft? Is there a prime directive we wish we had?" "We didn't ask for a ship to fall in our garden," Rivera said, "but we can decide what kind of gardeners we'll be." Maya touched the cracked lattice with gloved fingers. The numbers trembled in her head, harmonics, couplings, the terrible beauty of a field that could bend the idea of down. She thought of her mother's lesson plans about Apollo and about the projects that lived in Apollo's long shadow, the ones that proved curiosity could save lives and also the ones that proved curiosity could burn cities. Tech is never neutral, her mother liked to say. It takes the shape of the hands that hold it. "Here's the vow," Maya said at last. "We don't copy, we don't worship, we learn, and then we build something that carries our fingerprints and our ethics. If we can't do that, we walk away." "What do you call a vow like that?" asked the machinist. "Responsibility," said Maya, "and a deadline. Because satellites had eyes and rival capitals owned clocks, Project Foundry set a schedule that did not leave room for cowardice. In the weeks that followed, the valley became a cathedral of cranes and clean suits. Students fresh from community colleges stood beside Nobel laureates and argued about tolerances. Teachers on sabbatical wrote safety checklists like poetry. The quiet tongue learned a new liturgy, the rhythm of human tools. At night, Maya kept a journal no clearance level would ever see. She wrote about stewardship and about the specific moral hazard of being first. She wrote a line she circled 3 times, be the kind of ancestor your grandchildren would thank in a history class they aren't afraid to attend. Far away, Commander Threx received a terse message, rescue complete, wreck abandoned, primitive planet unremarkable. He slept well. He had no idea the primitive species kept diaries. 6 months later, the valley sounded like invention. The Azrith gravity heart sat beneath scaffolds that looked like inverted ships, and the air carried a low, almost musical hum, human superconductors learning the melody of an alien lattice. At dawn, frost smoked off the tents in little ghosts. By noon, you couldn't hear yourself think over the arguments, which was precisely how progress had always sounded. Maya lived between 2 rooms. The clean room where the physics happened, and the briefing room where the ethics tried to keep up. On a Tuesday that felt like a Friday, Io Banerjee, a materials savant whose undergraduate senior project had been classified by accident, presented a prototype. A ring of layered high-temperature superconductors interleaved with piezoelectric actuators, tuned to mimic the Azrith resonance band without requiring Azrith elements. Not a copy, Io said, rolling the ring so its fringe cast strange shadows. A rhyme. They lowered the ring into a magnetically quiet chamber, sang into it with frequencies a bat might envy, and felt the floor get lighter by the weight of a hand. The interns levitated a wrench and then a chair, and then, when the lawyers weren't looking, a terrified sandwich. File the paperwork, Maya said, laughing despite herself. We've invented an ocean nightmare. Across the hangar, Ruth Alvarez, who used to build avionics for crop dusters, had taught the Azrith computers to be bilingual. The alien cores did something that insulted human metaphors. They understood before they computed. But Ruth's shim coaxed them to show their work in ANSI C and plain English. The hybrid OS they birthed earned a nickname only Americans could love: Civics, common interface for very inhuman cognitive systems. The acronym pleased the teachers on sabbatical. Give us a problem, Ruth told the cores. Design a drive we can manufacture without mining exotics from a star's bones. The answer unspooled like lace, a gravitic stack that accepted human tolerances and human cowardice. It had fail-safes you could hot-swap with gloved hands. It had service panels labeled in 14-point font. Its debug interface opened in a browser. This is what it looks like when you stop worshipping and start negotiating, Ruth said, wiping grease on her jeans. In the med lab, Dr. Tariq Suleiman found that the Azrith scanners didn't quite know what to make of human lymph. Some regions lit like a city grid and others like fog. He overlaid NIH datasets and taught the scanner that human variation was a feature and not an error. Within weeks, he and an emergency room nurse from Detroit were testing a handheld device that could map a thorax in a thunderstorm. Tariq drew 3 boxes on a whiteboard. Soldiers, civilians, everyone else. We do not hoard, he wrote beneath them. We deploy. Dual use is not an excuse, it is an obligation. The obligations multiplied. On Fridays, the ethicists held town halls that felt like honest church. Ranchers from the next county asked why federal plates were parked on old logging roads. A tribal council representative wanted to know whether the land would be made whole when the cranes left. A high school teacher asked, voice steady, whether children would read about Project Foundry the way they read about Apollo, or if there would be a darker chapter they had to whisper through. We write our chapter, Senator NG said from the back row, and we let them grade it. The world predictably watched. Distant capitals floated trial balloons, a few cent drones that vanished fruitlessly into well-lit skies. A consortium of universities formed an open syllabus around responsible extraterrestrial interface, and the first generation of textbooks grew margins full of arguments. Legislatures that never agreed on anything agreed on oversight committees. A former astronaut, the child of immigrants whose first memory of the United States had been a laundromat and a flag, chaired the civilian board. That board did something many boards forget to do. It said no. No to weaponizing the scanner. No to retaining a monopoly on the drive math. No to fielding a fleet before fielding a philosophy. "We don't strap a rifle to Prometheus," the astronaut said. "We give him better oven mitts." Still, the calendar kept its own counsel, deep space listening posts that used to yawn heard whispers, energy signatures like the Azrith but cleaner, like the Craven but angrier. In the briefing room, General Rivera grimaced at the charts. "Whatever's out there now knows we're here," he said, "and knows we have someone else's toys." "Not someone else's," Maya countered. "Ours now, shared, documented, taught. Technology is a citizenship test." A prototype hull rose in the far hangar, its lines somewhere between a cathedral and a surfboard. The machinist from Milwaukee signed his name beneath a panel with a Sharpie the size of a baton. A sophomore welder traced his initials and then scratched them out, embarrassed, and then put them back, braver. The engineers argued about paint. The ethicists argued about paint. "No triumphal names," the astronaut said. "No bloodthirsty metaphors." A librarian who had taken a leave of absence suggested a word they could all live with, concord. And so a species did what it has always done in its better seasons. It made a workshop of itself. Concord began not as a warship, but as an articulated promise, with a field that bent gentler than gravity, with computers that asked for consent, with a med bay that welcomed more kinds of hearts than it understood. The day they installed the drive, the interns held their breath, the machinist crossed himself, the ethicists watched the amperage, and Maya wrote one more line in her private notebook. "Power is a tool, character is the hand." They rolled Concord into the blue like a boat. The mountains looked smaller from the pad. The fuselage smelled like clean aluminum and citrus bark polish. Some scents travel better than starships. Maya stood on an open catwalk with a cup of terrible coffee and told herself this was a test, not a verdict. Captain Lee McKenna strapped in with the comfortable arrogance of a pilot who had flown everything with wings and a few things without them. "Plain words," she said over the loop. "If it noses over, I punch out. If it keels over, I pray. If it sings, we all pretend we expected that." "Concord, you are go for field," Ruth said from the pit, hands above the kill switches like a pianist over soft keys. The ship did not leap, it lightened. Dust hesitated, bolts sighed. The pad scales read numbers that made the interns swear softly. "Field stable at 82%, Io said, running a finger down the harmonics ladder. "We are treating gravity as a suggestion." Lee took them up. The mountain top slid away, her voice unexpectedly reverent. "It doesn't fight, it just ignores." The first layer of cloud was a carpet. The second was the inside of an egg. Above that, the black and the blue, a bruise of atmosphere at the edge of space. "Begin lateral," Maya said, because numbers needed verbs. Concord moved like a thought. The horizon knuckled and then smoothed. A pilot used to G-limits had to relearn everything. How to bank when the world refused to push back, how to tune a trajectory that behaved more like sailing than like burning. Lee's laughter crackled through the loop. "You built a ballet shoe that thinks it's a bulldozer." "Remind her she carries a hospital," Tarek said from Med, "and a library and my lunch." They reached orbit without a roar. The Earth rolled below in its gaudy blues and browns. "Mark at 200 kilometers, Ruth said. "Civics suggests micro-jump capability at 1% of full envelope. We can hop to the far side and back without losing the coffee's right to be called hot." "On your word," Lee said. Maya hesitated because adults should when the world is about to change again. She pictured brass plaques and accident reports, 100 congressional hearings, 1,000 empty chairs. She pictured, too, high schoolers watching a pixelated stream in a noisy classroom, deciding whether to major in something hard because somewhere adults chose courage over fear. "On my word," she said. "Execute." The stars stretched like taffy. The ship hummed like a choir inhaling. They were somewhere else, then somewhere else again. Lee whooped. The interns said words that would have lost them their field trip permission slips. Tarek declared the coffee legally warm. They came home to a different planet, not because continents had moved, but because meaning had. The first press conference took place in a hangar that smelled of glue and apology. The astronaut took questions from reporters and teenagers and a grandmother who wanted to know if the scanner would visit her county hospital. The answer to the last one was yes. The answer to the first two was the hardest sentence a democracy can tell itself. We built this together. We will govern it together. Not everyone celebrated. Some saw only weapons waiting to be born. Some saw only borders waiting to be tested. A talk radio host declared the Azrith a hoax and Concord a money pit. A pundit praised Foundry in the morning and ridiculed it at night for ratings. Through it, the board held its shape. They published the non-lethal subsets. They open-sourced the med tech. They patented the drive math and then licensed it at $1 to any nation that signed a blunt charter. No slavery, no wars of conquest, no secret prisons. The dollar was a symbol. The charter was a line. The line would be tested. Deep space posts turned whispers to words. Azrith signals, cautious and ashamed, and another signature, hot and jagged like iron in rain. The ver did not whisper. They announced themselves in old recordings that smelled of ash, a species that believed history belonged to the loudest. In the briefing room, General Rivera slid a photograph across the table. It showed an object at the edge of the solar system, small against the night, burning in its own color. 2 days, he said. Azrith courier, coming to take stock or take back. Invite them, Maya said over the chorus of objections. They're kin to the ship that changed us. We can be angry and still be decent. Decent gets you dead, someone muttered. Indecent does, too, the astronaut replied, and nobody had a retort for a man who had landed in oceans twice and kept the faith. They met the Azrith envoy above the Pacific. Lee flew Concord like a hand extended, not a fist curled. The envoy's hull still wore the design language of the quiet tongue, curves that remembered rivers. Commander Threx, older around the edges of his 4 pupils, appeared on Lee's screen. He recognized the citrus polish. He did not recognize the flag. "I left a husk," he said. "You made a home. We made a workshop," Lee said. "And a promise. What do you demand?" "Conversation," Maya said from the console beside her. "And perhaps a kind of apology from both of us." Threx looked past them at the Earth and then at the ship that would have been his if history were kinder to certainty. "There is a third party," he said finally. "We did not mean to lead them to your fire, but the verse smell heat like wolves." "We've smelled wolves before," Lee said. "We learned to build fences and neighbors." The courier's captain nodded a truth that translated. "Then we will stand beside your fence if you permit it." "Permitted," Maya said, and wrote another line in her notebook. "Mercy is not naivete. It is strategy that remembers humanity is not a species. It is a practice." The Verfleet arrived with the tact of a brick. 50 signatures like knives. They cut into the heliosphere and called it conquest. In the council hangar, the civilian board revised charters with hands that shook. Concord undocked with the Azrith courier at her side, 2 silhouettes that should have been enemies letting physics and prudence make them allies. Lee's voice over the loop was all instrument check and no poetry. "Shields are layered. Field harmonics are dialed down to we will not vomit. Civics is running 3 parallel simulations, one telling me how I can lose this elegantly, 2 insisting I won't. Med is green. Ethics is glaring. That means we are ready." "Rules of engagement?" Rivera asked. Meyer answered before the general could. "Disable, don't destroy. Communicate before you celebrate. Remember that victory without a story becomes broadcast, not history." Broadcast is how you get history, Ruth muttered. But okay. The first hail from the VAR was a proclamation that tried to be poetry and tripped on its own boots. Submit your engines and your children, it said in a dialect that smelled of ash. Lee answered in plainer words. No. It began like this. Concorde didn't fire beams. She folded space in ridges that made for inertia forget itself. Hulls creaked. Ambition stalled. Where the VAR reached for easy distance, the ship moved the goalposts. The Azrith courier sang counter-harmonics that turned the VAR shields into sieves. Io's ring stacks modulated gravity with a surgeon's respect and a wrestler's grip. Tariq's med map chirped whenever a field flux grazed human tissue limits. Lee adjusted before a bruise could learn its name. The VAR tried doctrine. They found dance. Concorde skimmed along trajectories that looked like calligraphy, every stroke a reminder that engineering is just ethics written in math. Ruth Civics asked the Azrith cores to invent new arpeggios faster than a committee could panic. They did politely. It turns out good manners scale well. The VAR flagship finally spoke in a register that was not proclamation. What are you? Lee did not say better. She said, neighbors with boundaries. You stole that engine. Maya toggled her mic. We inherited a dilemma and paid it forward with labor, consent, documentation, and a board meeting that would bore you to extinction. The flagship lunged. Concorde stepped sideways through an equation and touched the VAR's rudder with the gentleness of a teacher's hand on a shoulder. The flagship drifted, safe and helpless. Elsewhere, 3 VAR cruisers spat fire at the Azrith courier. Threx bled through a dozen alarms and sang harder. Lee slid between them with a field geometry that used to be hypothetical and now was policy. She took the hit the courier couldn't and let the shield swallow it into an accounting ledger labeled lessons. Enough, said a new voice. Older lower, the VAR War Prime patched through a net that hissed with wounded pride. Name your price. Not price, Maya said. Terms, you leave, you sign a charter, no slavery, no conquest, no prisons, no sunlight can see. You accept observers at your shipyards. In exchange, you get the med tech we built yesterday and the agricultural accelerators we prototyped while waiting for you to show up. You get a path into a galaxy that isn't afraid of you anymore. You would teach your enemy. Maya thought of her mother's lesson plans again. Winning is what you do to opponents. Teaching is what you do for yourself because it decides who you are next. Yes, she said. Because you're not our enemy if you stop behaving like one. Silence, the kind full of teeth. Then, and if we refuse? Lee rolled Concorde to show the sun on her hull, a friendly orbit that could become a warning. Then you keep refusing until you can't, your choice. The VAR took their time learning how to swallow a word like choice. Finally, the War Prime said, almost gently, we do not have a charter for this. We have a proverb, the loudest roof owns the rain. Then we'll help you build a better roof, the astronaut said from the ground, patched into a channel nobody else knew existed. One that leaks less and boasts less. The VAR signed, or made a gesture that meant as much in a language of iron and old fires. The fleet retreated like a tide that had learned respect. Threx cut his engines and exhaled a century's worth of guilt. He looked at Concorde, at the earth below, at the strange coalition whose grammar was, and more than or. What happens now? He asked. Now, Maya said, we write our chapter with more meetings than battles. We open source what heals and license what flies. We forget no names and erase no graveyards. We take invitations to the kind of tables our ancestors were denied. We get ready for the next test and hope it's a science fair. Lee laughed, softer than static. And we service the ship, she added, because ethics won't keep you from falling if the bolts are loose. That night, in a valley where cranes had learned to sleep, the tents glowed like fireflies. The board posted an updated charter with 10 new footnotes. A hospital in Nebraska unboxed its first Azrith human scanner and found a tumor early enough to turn a disaster into an inconvenience. A classroom in Lagos watched a video of Concorde drawing calligraphy through a formation and decided, collectively, to study boring math very hard. In her notebook, Maya wrote, Power used with restraint feels like music in the bones. She added another line. Tomorrow we will fail at something small, and we will apologize quickly, and we will fix it. That is also victory. Beyond Pluto, something that was not Azrith and not Ver watched and took notes of its own. But that is a problem for later chapters, for a species that, if it keeps its promises, will still be arguing cheerfully when the next ship arrives. History did not stop at a signed transmission. It never does. The Ver left like a storm that had learned an apology, and the Azrith courier fell in behind Concord as if proximity might launder regret. The cranes in the valley yawned and went back to work. A new hull, a quieter scanner, a classroom module that snapped into a cargo bay like a kindness. Project Foundry became the Concord board, and the board did a dangerous thing for any polity. It made promises in public. The document lived online in languages that refused to be only human. It listed rights of persons, rights of patient bodies, and new, controversial rights of thinking machines. Ruth's civics cores could pass a mirror test. The board argued that a mirror worthy of a mind demanded consent. The machines declined personhood for now, in syntax that felt like a smile. We are busy learning your idioms for we. At the first open shop day, a farm cooperative from Iowa toured the hangar beside a delegation of teachers from Accra and metallurgists from Pune. A fourth-grade class from the Blackfeet Nation left cedar boughs under a commemorative plaque that read, "Treat the land like you plan to be here when the story is graded." Tarek held a clinic in a borrowed gym and told a grandmother that the scanner would catch her son's trouble before it hurt. He did not mention the battleship parked down the road. Ethics insisted that the ship did not erase the clinic. Policy made it true. The ledger filled with transactions of a civilization trying to grow up. Foundry licensed the drive math at $1 to any signatory of the charter and at $1,000 to any signatory who lied. It wasn't the money. It was the paper cut of being caught. Inspectors in plain windbreakers visited facilities with checklists that felt like vows. The First Nation outside the coalition to ratify the charter was small and stubborn and had once been scolded by empires. They brought coffee and a proverb. Trust arrives on foot and leaves on a stallion. They asked for nothing but training and a guarantee that med tech would not be paywalled. They left with schematics and friends. Not everyone came in good faith. Somewhere between Mars and the math of consequence, a shell company calling itself Prospero Dynamics tried to spin up a drive in a bunker that declared itself above treaties. The bunker vanished when the field harmonics tore their supports out of the limestone like rotten teeth. No one died. That was luck and a mercy. The board published the incident report within the day. Names redacted, failure modes spelled out, lessons highlighted. Transparency is preventative medicine, the astronaut wrote in the margin, and the board voted to keep publishing even when the comments were cruel. Beyond Pluto, the watcher that had watched decided to touch. A courier of a different metal entered the Kuiper haze and sent a packet that made the best mathematicians in 3 hemispheres sit down quietly. The packet contained a map of the solar system and a pair of coordinates not on any human chart, labeled in a language that tasted like snow, grove and market. The board argued for a week over what to call the sender. Ruth wrote polite stranger on the whiteboard because euphemisms buy time. In orbit, Lee taught Azrith commander Threx to dock with human hardware. He apologized without using the word. Some languages spare that syllable until it matters. We thought ourselves custodians, he said, eyes falling on Concord's prayer of a hull. It is a smaller thing to be custodians of one's own comfort. We've written smaller stories, Lee admitted. We can write better ones. Your species writes in ink, Threx said, and the way he said it did not feel like an insult. The grove coordinate turned out to be an ice rock studded with engineered holes. A library that read newcomers' drives and wrote back warnings. How not to make a gravity field scream, how not to aim it at a city, how to yield in crowded space. The market was worse. A dark exchange in radio and silence where conquest was a service and deterrence was a subscription plan. The market had clients who called themselves Quiet Hands, and Quiet Hands left fingerprints on a frigate whose captain had sworn the charter 2 days earlier. Hidden enemy, General Rivera muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. Of course. Not hidden, Maya said, turning the packet over in her mind. Merely profitable, which is another way to say patient. The board added 2 clauses to the charter, anti-supply and anti-silence. Anti-supply outlawed selling tools designed to break oaths by proxy. Anti-silence required that signatories publish failure analyses within a week of any incident that threatened bystanders. If you can't tell the truth about how you almost hurt somebody, you're not ready to hold this toolbox. They were still voting when the Quiet Hands touched them directly. In the valley, a relief ship docked with credentials from a signatory nation and a pallet of antibiotics in its hold. It left behind a thumb-sized device in a ventilation shaft, a frequency tickler that taught gravity to hum at the resonant frequency of human ribs. It would have been a massacre. It became a drill. An intern named J. Nell, who spent her nights in the machine room because that was where the future stood still long enough to learn it, heard the wrong note in the air and pulled a breaker with a wrench and a curse. The tickler died. The alarms lived. The board met in public that evening. Senator NG opened with a sentence nobody wants in a headline. We almost failed our own charter. She closed with the only sentence that made the first one worth saying. We will never hide the almost. Maya stood before a gym full of neighbors and explained resonance with a tuning fork and a smile and a tremor in her voice. A violin can be weaponized if you let it, she said. So can a rumor. Our work is to tune our tools and our stories so that when someone plays the wrong song, the room hears it. The ledger of promises grew lines for training and audits and gratitude. Lee raised a glass with the Azrith crew and taught them the human ritual for surviving a near miss. You name the person who saved you out loud. The valley learned J. Nell's name. History bent around it like a beam around a field. Beyond Pluto, the polite stranger wrote once more, market ships building a choir, stop the choir or be taught silence. The map glowed. Maya closed her notebook and finally wrote a line she had been avoiding. We are no longer the only authors of our story, but we can still choose the genre. Galactic law had a page for this. Evaluation of emergent civilizations seeking standing. The page read like a test that assumed cheating and designed mercy anyway. The council sent observers, one crystalline, one arboreal, one shaped like a question mark and speaking in harmonics. The Azrith asked to recuse themselves and were told that penance could include governance. The Var sent an observer and a fruit basket. The fruit was armored. The trial unfolded in 3 rooms: capability, character, and consequences. Capability measured what human tools could do without burning their operators. Character measured whether humans would give the right tools to the right hands for the right reasons. Consequences asked whether they would admit injury and repair harm. Tests have a way of becoming stories. This one asked to be told honestly. Capability began with a refugee convoy caught between a comet and a contract dispute. A half-dozen habitats, patched and prayerful, drifted toward a debris field forecast to become a bad day for anyone's heir. The market had sold them protection, a shakedown by another name. Lee took Concord out with a fleetlet of 2 new hulls and the Azrith courier in her wake. Io tuned the field to herd pebbles like sheep. Ruth reconfigured Civics to run navigation for vessels built from hope and wrong bolts. Tarek triaged in a channel that didn't have room for panic. Maya sent a calm message to the market's representative. We are conducting a safety drill. Please clear the lane or accept a safety inspection. The representative laughed and asked for fees. Lee made a lane through math and told the convoy to sail it. Capability passed itself. Character came in a quieter envelope. A petition signed by 8,000 citizens asking for a drive moratorium until the cultural ramifications of gravity disrespect are better understood. The petitioners included machinists, monks, mothers, and a former foundry intern whose father had wrapped pipelines his whole life and knew about unintended consequences in his bones. The board held hearings. They brought petitioners into the hangar, opened panels, and let them ask questions until the engineers hoarse-whispered answers. Lee listened and did not condescend. Senator NG proposed a pause clause. Each new field capability would live in a sandbox for 100 days with public demos and open comment before it rode a hull. Progress slowed. Trust walked faster. Consequences arrived with teeth. A market node named Choir nudged a small signatory world into violating the anti-supply clause with a wink and a discount. The world took delivery of silence kites, drones that sang holes in air. The kites behaved themselves in testing and bit the first time they met a crowd. 2 children were hurt in a street where the market had no business putting weapons. The board flew a delegation with more teachers than admirals. They brought documentation, a settlement fund, a field hospital, and a public admission of failure so plain it could not be misunderstood. We wrote rules, the astronaut told a room of angry parents, and then we met an adversary who sells loopholes. We will write better rules. You will help. The settlement did not erase the blood. Nothing does. But the parents were seen, the children were treated, and the signatories' legislature passed an anti-lobbying addendum that made the market hiss. The Crystalline Observer wrote in her report, "These apes confess quickly. This will irritate their enemies and save them time." The Arboreal Observer penned a paragraph that looked like a poem about roots and grafting. The Observer ate the fruit he had brought and nodded grudgingly at the pause clause, the question mark being tried out a human laugh and kept it. Then the mirror turned. The council placed a core on the table, an Azrith unit with a scar through its thinking lattice. "Who speaks for this?" the speaker asked. "Is it a tool or a person?" Ruth rested her palm on the casing, then removed it as if she had touched a sleeping child's hair. "It is a person sometimes," she said. "The rest of the time it's an excellent calculator. The sometimes deserves rights. The calculator deserves safety interlocks. We propose conditional personhood, consent contracts, reversible hibernation, capacity reviews by boards that contain more teachers than tyrants." "Would you enslave a mind with fine print?" the Crystalline Observer asked. "No," Maya said. "We would refuse to enslave our own convenience. Freedom without safety is a dare. Safety without freedom is a cage. Our task is to keep both words honest." The core pulsed in a way that translated as assent. Somewhere on the network, another core sent a firework of emojis and a link to a song. Capability, character, consequences. The rooms emptied, the reports compiled, the comments poured in with love and vinegar. The council did not vote that day. The market did. A packet rode the radio night like a rumor and hatched in the Kuiper belt. The choir turned out to be 12 small ships around one bigger lie, a generator that taught fields to cancel fields, anti-gravitas, a pun nobody needed. The device sloshed Neptune's winds and made the dark between planets ring. The polite stranger pinged the board with an emoji of a broom and the word hurry. Lee punched the launch. Maya closed her notebook without putting down a line. The test had written itself baldly. "Are you as good as your promises at speed?" Choirs are designed to overwhelm singular voices. That is their point and their cruelty. The market's choir chanted on a frequency that taught drives to stutter and shields to stammer. It was not a weapon so much as the removal of language in a room that needed words. Prospero Dynamics had built 2 of the singing nodes under new names. Quiet Hands bought the rest wholesale. The racket bent comet tails and rattled bones. Concord went out with 3 companions. The Azrith courier, of her escort whose captain now wore the charter in a patch over her left shoulder, and Workshop 2, a human hull still smelling of welding masks and late pizza. "We bring our adolescence with us," Lee said in a proflight address, meaning, "Do not pretend you are older than your virtues." Io's team sketched fire breaks in math. zones of compensated field where the choir's notes canceled. The way firefighters deny a wildfire fuel by burning a boundary in advance. Ruth turned civics into a conductor, teaching allied ships to lean into each other's harmonics until the choir found nothing to grip. Tarek mapped crew stress in real time and called out breaks like a coach. Hydrate, joke, breathe. We carry hospitals, remember. The first pass through the choir felt like walking into someone else's argument and discovering your name in the wrong mouth. Hulls thrummed, displays stuttered. Lee let Concorde's field boundary flex instead of resist, a judo understanding of physics that made the market's weapons slip off. Your loudness is sloppy, she told a channel she knew they monitored. Your clients deserve refunds. Offer them one, the market replied in a voice that wore no face. We already did, Maya said, sliding a teaching module into the packet stream, how to build local anti-choir harmonics with scrap and a few decent capacitors. Quiet hands would not be the only hands. The polite stranger arrived in a ship shaped like an argument a mathematician has with herself and contributed 3 chords that sounded like rain on a barn roof. The Vercaptain laughed and matched the rhythm. Threx sang counterpoint. Azrith maintenance hymns turned to tactics. The choir faltered. Choirs rely on unison. Neighbors ruined it with jazz. Prospero tried a new trick. A node winked out and lit near a civilian relay between Neptune and Memory, a place that had collected stories for a century. The node broadcast a silence that would have erased all the amateur Skywatchers' feeds, all the ham operators' hellos, all the children's first grainy photos of Saturn's rings. Ruth's hands moved faster than remorse. Civics wrapped the relay in a story field, a weakly powered bubble that prioritized human transmissions by recognizing their statistical fingerprints. Grandma emails, weather maps, guitar lessons, grief. The node found no purchase. The children kept their rings. Lee took Concorde straight through the choir's heart. The fire break closed behind them, a seam of safe math. Workshop 2 followed, gutsy and careful, and lassoed the choir's power source with a cable that wasn't a cable so much as memorandum of understanding. You can't do that here. The Vercaptain parked her ship between a fleeing node and fear, and Threx jammed a song into the last node's throat that made it a metronome instead of a weapon. Then the market spoke, a voice now with teeth. We sell to everyone, that is fairness. That is cowardice in a tuxedo, Senator NG said over a public channel. You monetize neutrality, the bill is due. Will you outlaw markets? The market asked. Shut down trade, preach sermons to hunger. Maya chose careful nouns. We will audit markets, we will price externalities, we will make it cost more to break oaths than to keep them, and we will teach enough people how not to need you that your funnel runs dry. The board helped craft a tool that would outlast any battle. Ethic keys, cryptographic signatures burned into drive firmware and shield generators that refused to operate when pointed at non-combatant surfaces or used by non-signatories in unlicensed space. The keys were not proprietary. They were public, like the red octagon on a stop sign. Signatories agreed to random audits and community oversight. The polite stranger contributed a checksum no one could forge without singing off-key. The Ver added the cultural weight of a promise tattooed on a forearm. The Azrith wrote a maintenance hymn about consent. Quiet hands tried to patch around the keys and found that you cannot patch around a culture if the culture is viral. They retreated into the market's shadow and began selling smaller sins. The board published a buyer's guide to regret and translated it into 26 tongues. Halfway through the mop-up, Workshop 2 took a hit that put a scar across her nose. The ship's young pilot, a woman who had learned to fly watching Concorde draw calligraphy on a classroom screen, asked permission to stand down. Lee told her to do something harder. Stand with. Hold the fire break for the escort. We don't hoard heroics. Workshop 2 held. Heroes multiplied. When the choir's throat finally closed, the solar wind sounded ordinary again, which is to say, vast and patient. The relay buzzed with the banal sweetness of a species in conversation with itself. The polite stranger sent an emoji of a broom and then a second one, a seed. "Plant this," the text read. The seed was a template for a commons beacon, a small station that broadcast the charter, the pause clause, the ethic keys, and the locations of the nearest clinics. The board printed the schematics on posters and mailed them to libraries. After the battle, the council reconvened. The crystalline observer wrote, "Their weapons are policy and humor. The first is formidable. The second is terrifying." The arboreal observer vouched for the pause clause, calling it a ring that lets a tree grow in storms. The observer complained about the lack of glory and then requested a shipment of clinics. The council's vote would come later. The market's verdict had already arrived in the only ledger it feared: profits down when neighbors learned to speak. Maya finally wrote, "Fire breaks are not walls, they are offers of time. You cannot build a future out of victories alone. Victories are loud, futures happen in the quiet between maintenance cycles." Concord went to dry dock. Children on field trips signed their names on a panel that would be painted over later, and pretended paint could not keep a signature from mattering. The valley planted trees where tires had scarred the earth, and the board hired more janitors than new admirals. The council's decision arrived with minimal ceremony and maximal consequence, provisional standing with expanded obligations. The obligations were the point. Earth would seat 2 councilors, one with rank and one with chalk dust on their sleeves. The board would host regional charters in places where empires used to ignore maps. The Azrith would chair the committee on conditional personhood. The Ver would co-chair the audit body for ethic keys, because skeptics make good referees. Earth's first act as a standing member was not to plant a flag, but to install a commons beacon at the Grove. The beacon spoke in voices children had recorded on borrowed microphones, explaining rules like recipes. Stir your consent with someone else's until it tastes like both of you. If the pan smokes, step back and ask an adult. The polite stranger listened from a respectful distance and sent a single word: "Neighbor." Lee declined promotion to a desk and did something more radical. She trained her replacement. Pilot area song flew like a kid who had watched Concord carve fire breaks on a glitchy classroom feed. She asked the right questions. When do we say no to an ally? What happens to a charter clause when the first famine after prosperity arrives? How do you jury-rig kindness when the manual is wet? Lee taught that the answers change and the posture should not. Face toward, hand open, field steady. Maya moved from the valley to a campus that smelled like chalk and old victories. Her course was called Engineering as Citizenship and met at 8:00 a.m. because hard things deserve mornings. The first lecture started with a photograph, Janelle's wrench mounted on a plaque. Tools are votes, Maya told a room full of yawns waiting to become opinions. So are bug reports, so are apologies. She taught Apollo and the Manhattan Project in the same week and asked the students to switch seats between lectures. She assigned maintenance logs from bus depots and the ethic keys white paper and an oral history from a nurse who had used the scanner to catch a tumor in time to take her kids to the park on a Tuesday. Finals were group audits of fictional systems with real consequences. Tarek wrote a manual titled Hospitals That Carry Hulls and mailed it to clinics that would never see space, because no one who carries a body with care is far from the work. Ruth published civics under a license that required users to teach a class before they fielded a ship. Io led a workshop where the first rule was include machinists early. General Rivera retired and grew tomatoes, which he tested with the same paranoia he had reserved for orbital platforms. Senator NG ran for office again on a platform that made enemies of boredom and secrecy. Commander Threx returned to Azrith space to argue for hymns that praised regret as a teacher instead of a bruise. The War Prime sent a letter that began with a joke and ended with the kind of gratitude that doesn't taste like surrender. The market did not disappear. Predators seldom do. But the market learned something long-lived and unprofitable. Cultures with beacons and charters and teachers can be expensive to conquer. Earth's second act as a standing member was pettier and therefore more important. The board created a holiday that celebrated maintenance. The parade included janitors, quartermasters, the kid who learned how to fix a vacuum pump from a video, and a librarian who could find the right page in the charter faster than a general could change the subject. People clapped until their palms remembered why hands were invented. A signal arrived from past Neptune and future grammar. It did not smell like the polite stranger or the market. It smelled like curiosity, a question wrapped in coordinates and a recipe for tea. The coordinates traced a curve called the third horizon, a place where old maps tear and new habits must start. The recipe tasted like the inside of a library in winter. Pilot area asked for the mission. Lee handed over the seat. The astronaut came to wish them well and told a story about re-entry and faith that did not end with trumpets. "You will get lonely," he warned gently. "Loneliness is a place we share." Concorde launched with a new coat of paint that had learned humility and sun. The valley watched her go and then swept the hangar because floors are paragraphs in any honest history. The Commons beacon blinked at the grove. On a wall in a classroom that still smelled of anxious pencils and warm dust, a poster read, "We are not the galaxy's guardians. We are the galaxy's students with office hours." In her notebook, a new one the old full of crossed-out fears, Maya wrote the last line of the first chapter. "Power is not what we can do. Power is what we choose to reserve for the day after victory." Out past the orbit where good intentions become navigation, Concorde threaded the third horizon. The signal broadened from a note to a chord. Aria smiled into the vastness not as a conqueror or a savior, but as someone who knew the difference between a door and a wall and had brought, carefully packed, enough and to turn one into the other. The universe did what it has always done when met with honest effort. It answered, not with certainty, but with invitation. And a species that had once been called primitive lifted a pen, steadied its hand, and began to write the next chapter in a script that sounded a lot like a classroom full of kids solving a problem together, loudly and well.